This is Griff Ruby continuing my series on Isaac Asimov. Now beginning to delve in an introductory part here to his short stories. The short stories have a very special place in his life. He spent a lot of years at the very beginning of his writing career only writing stories. They were all more or less short stories, novellas, and some novels and novellas along the way, but basically short stories. And it wasn't, with two notable categories of exception. However, they kind of just sat in magazines. I'll start with the notable exceptions. The first category of short stories that really caught on and became something worth publishing was his robot stories, which were gathered in I, Robot. The stories got changed a bit. He wanted to weave this all together into an account that kind of biographically bases itself on the life of Susan Calvin. So, for example, when you get to the robot stories that involve Powell and Donovan, Susan Calvin's still suddenly there in the background, even though those stories didn't include Susan Calvin in most cases, I suspect. And there may be other changes as well. Certainly one of the stories, the first of them, called Strange Playfellow, definitely had some very major changes in going from its original publication form to the form included in I, Robot, though it is still essentially the same story. The other basic category was that covered by the Foundation stories that were gathered up into a trilogy of Foundation and Empire, Second Foundation. These are they're almost not really short stories as much as they are stories of that really belong to a larger work as such. All the robot stories are kind of gathered in that as well. It wasn't, however, until 1955 that you could approach his editor that he was working with on Doubleday and say to him, "I'd like to put together a collection of just unrelated, unconnected short stories." I mean, those things don't usually sell, and if he'd offered that earlier, it wouldn't have gone through. But at Doubleday, the fellow said, "You know what? Let's just do it." In 1955, so he did his very first, which I have here, the Martian Way, and other stories. But it came out, and that's exactly what it was. So we had The Martian Way itself, Youth, The Deep, and Sucker Bait. So that was like his first attempt, and it probably didn't sell as well as his novels, which by this point had come to include all three Galactic Era novels, plus The Currents of Space, and I think even The End of Eternity may have seen print earlier in the year than this book. So all of those books were doing pretty well. And he would gather up some more, quite a bit more, in Earth is Room Enough. And then again in 9 Tomorrows. I would do a lot of good stories. Those all, of course, date from when he was still writing and publishing new books every year. After that, he kind of bowed out of fiction and devoted himself entirely to nonfiction. But there's another book I want to refer to here, and I'm actually going to be quoting out of this a little bit. Unfortunately, I don't have it as a. It's before the Golden Age, and that's the. He talks about his earlier history. And there's some interesting information. And one of them I found on page 311 talks about when he first went to Seth Low, the boys' high school, but it was actually a special annex to the boys' high school. He started in September of 1932. They call it the Waverly Annex, kind of a halfway house to those who are on their way to getting into the school. So he says this. The annex, which they call the Waverly Annex, contributed a column to the high school newspaper, a news from Waverly kind of thing, and I volunteered to write it. I don't remember how many columns I did, but I do remember that on one occasion there was a mini stir occasioned by the fact that I had naively reported that we had let out early one day when that had been done against the rules. The head of the annex found that he had to do some explaining, and from then on he read my column before I was allowed to pass it on to the newspaper column office. This column was the first occasion on which I had written anything for publication. It was the first time I had ever seen any words of my own in actual print with my own name on them. So that really is his first published stuff, and it's nonfiction. So, although it's just what's going on in the Waverly Annex, which, I doubt would be terribly interesting, and it's probably one of the most ephemeral things you can imagine. A school paper. I don't know whether there's how much chance there is. It's the Seth Low School or Boys High School or whatever else that you went to, or whatever remains of it today, might still have in some archive or box somewhere some of their old school papers from that era that would have these articles, these bylines that he wrote back then. So, but they actually predate the oldest story that he ever published, and that was while he was still at the high school. They had a little digest called the Boys High Recorder, and he published a little work in that called Little Brothers. This is so short, I can actually just read the whole thing. Little Brothers. My mission in life right now is to express the venomous feelings that we big brothers have for the bane of our lives, little brothers. When I first received the news that I had a little brother on July 25, 1929, I felt slightly uncomfortable. As for myself, I knew nothing about brothers, but many of my friends had related at great length the inconveniences, to say the least, of attending babies. On August 3, my little brother came home. All I could see was a little bundle of pink flesh, with apparently no ability to do the slightest mischief. That night, I suddenly sprang out of bed with goose flesh all over me and my hair on end. I had heard a shriek, apparently made by no earthly being. In response to my frenzied questions, my mother informed me in a commonplace manner that it was just the baby. Just the baby. I was almost knocked unconscious. A puny 9-pound baby, 10 days old, to make such a scream. Why, I was convinced that no less than 3 men together could have strained their vocal cords to such an extent. But this was only the beginning. When he began teething, the real torture came. I did not sleep a wink for 2 months. I only existed by sleeping with my eyes open in school. And it still wasn't all. Easter was coming, and I was feeling joyous at the prospect of a trip to Rhode Island when that kid brother of mine got the measles and everything went up like smoke. Soon he reached the age where his teeth were already cut, and I hoped to obtain a little peace, but no, that could not be. I had yet to learn that when a child learns to walk and talks baby language, he is rather more of an inconvenience than a cyclone, with a hurricane thrown in for good measure. His favorite recreation was that of falling down the stairs, hitting each step with a resounding bump. This occurred on the average of once every other minute, and always brought on a scolding from my mother, not far from him, but for me, not for him, but for me, for not taking care of him. This taking care of him was not as easy as it sounds. The baby usually shows his devotion by grabbing generous fistfuls of hair and pulling with a strength you could never have thought possible in a 1-year-old. When, after a few minutes of excruciating torture, you persuade him to let go, he seeks diversion in hitting your shins with a heavy piece of iron, preferably a sharp or pointed one. Not only is the baby a pest when awake, but is doubly so when taking his daily nap. This is a typical scene. I am sitting in a chair next to the carriage, deeply immersed in the Three Musketeers, and my little brother, is apparently sleeping peacefully. But he really isn't. With an uncanny instinct, in spite of his closed eyes and inability to read, he knows exactly when I reach an exciting point, and with a malicious grin selects that very moment to awake. With a groan, I leave my book and rock him till my arms feel as if they will fall off any minute. By the time he does go back to sleep, I have lost interest in the famous trio, and my day is ruined. Now my little brother is 4.5 years old, and most of these aggravating habits have disappeared. But I feel in my bones that there is more to come. I shudder to think of the day when he'll enter school and place a new burden upon my shoulders. I feel absolutely sure that not only will I be afflicted with the housework, which my hard-earned teachers will give me, homework, which my hard-earned teachers will give me, but also be responsible for my little brothers. I wish I were dead. So, those kinds of things that was it. And it got in because all the other writers who submitted things to the Boys High Recorder and wrote these deep, serious pieces, very tragic and so forth. And he was the only one who had submitted something that was light and at least an attempt at being comical. So they had to have something to balance that off, so it got in. So that was his first published fiction. Now, there's some other unpublished fiction, though, just to note. We all know about this Cosmic Corkscrew, the first thing he actually wrote with the express intent of publishing it, and it never got published, and it didn't get saved, and it doesn't exist. But he had attempted to write, even before his newspaper column from Waverly Annex, a series of chapters about a group of people called the Greenville Chums at college. Okay. Later on, he says that he attempted a fantasy sort of story with wizards and gnomes and magic or whatever, because he thought that would be easier and probably more to what he'd be able to do. And then he had even attempted some sort of another science fiction story, which he had also done some chapters of before quietly abandoning before he started Cosmic Corkscrew. So this kind of brings us up to, we'll be ready for the next part, where we'll be talking about each of his stories. Now, one could handle his stories in a different way, in several ways. Usually one might think to say, well, we'll just take a book here and do the stories in the book, say, Asimovs Stories, for example. Okay. Well, I'm not going to do it that way. I think my approach is going to be to take the short stories themselves as originally published, except for a few instances that's not reasonably possible for good reasons, but pretty much by and large, that shows how they originally met their public, and sometimes they're a little bit different from how they were when gathered. I've already indicated what happened with some of the stories that went into iRobot. There were, of course, other stories, robot stories, that didn't fit into iRobot, and they got collected into the rest of the robots. Although, you see, this big fat book not only has some robot stories, it also has the entire text of the Caves of Steel of the Naked Sun. But then it also has, another smaller section with all those other robot stories that didn't get gathered up into the iRobot, even though they were written in that time. When they did a paperback of the rest of the robots, they did a far more sensible thing. They included just the short stories that were robot stories and were not in iRobot up until 1964, which was kind of a nadir of his publishing time, writing story time anyway. He totally bowed out of fiction by that point. But short stories are with him, and they continue all his career. I can't say I'm going to get to all of them. That'd be insane. But at least try to cover all the early ones. And there's quite a host of interesting places that he's got. Then I've already showed you the Asimovs Mysteries. Another collection of some of his former ones, for Nightfall. Of course, Nightfall is a very famous classic short story of his. We'll be covering that in due course of time. And by this time, people were starting to ask about what about his really old stuff. So he actually came up with the early Asimov. And in the early Asimov, this is actually a particularly good book because it actually lists, well, the first 60 stories he had written for real publication. He wasn't counting the Little Brothers piece. So it starts with Cosmic Corkscrew. It lists a few others that are lost. This Irrational Planet got lost. Paths of Destiny got lost. Gnosis and Glory got lost. The Decline and Fall got lost. Life Before Birth got lost. The Brothers got lost. Masks got lost. So there's a lot of stories he wrote. These are just plain lost. And that's all. The story behind some of these, well, let me get to those when we get into that. Cover those briefly. But all those old stories are gone. But everything else, the first 60 stories he wrote, got published somewhere. Although in a lot of cases, that somewhere, especially in the earlier ones, was here. So it has a lot of stuff. And one thing that's kind of neat here, it also copies the stories faithfully. So you actually have the text pretty much exactly as it first made its public, minus maybe the occasional typographical error, I think. But other than that, it's pretty much exact. The other stories, I've noticed a lot of things that he publishes have changed, and I will intend to annotate some of those changes as we go along. But this is a great place to start and really get a sense of where he started. Of course, he has a few other collections that are of some significance. By Jupiter has a lot of short stories. Then the Bicentennial Man has lots of short stories. And even finally the Winds of Change. So he has writing short stories, and of course I've already shown I, Robot and Foundation stories. So I think that's enough for now. That introduces short stories. So what I'll be doing next will be to take a story at a time and just talk about the one story. Okay.